Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's DBA virtual chapter presentation. Our topic today is Windows clustering for the DBA, part 1, and yes, that implies there will be a part 2, so we're looking forward to both these sessions. Today's speaker is Ryan Adams. I've had the pleasure of knowing Ryan for several years now, working with PASS and at the Summit. So we're in store for a great presentation today. And as a reminder, my name is Mike Clark. I'll be the moderator today. And today our sponsor is Hewlett Packard Enterprise. I'd like to give a thank you to our sponsor for Hewlett Packard for coming alongside PASS in general, and specifically the DBA virtual chapter. It's always great to have good partners, and we appreciate that. One of the things that we do at PASS is we have a lot of education today and socialization and just training. And so today's is kind of a mix of all of those. Today's session, DBA virtual chapter session, is just one of many virtual chapters that exists. They're technology based, from cloud to in-memory. There's languages from Spanish to Russian, Chinese, and so forth. And then as well as localization stuff. So if you're interested in any aspect of these virtual chapters, if you go to sequelpass.org and click on virtual chapters, you'll be able to get more information about each of these. And please sign up for as many of those as makes sense. I think virtual chapters are like voting. You should do it early and often. So be involved with as many as you can handle. Another form of training that PASS has is SQL Saturday. They're around the world these days. We have many upcoming here in the U.S., EMEA, Latin America, as well as APAC. So if you have a free Saturday coming up anywhere near these locations, sign up at SQLSaturday.com and attend. They're great times of learning. And if you have a topic that you'd like to present, go to SQLSaturday.com and put in an option to do a presentation. We're always looking for great presenters. But the culmination of all the training and networking and so forth is the PASS Summit. It's an annual summit. This year it's going to be in Seattle. Currently it's $21.95 for the full summit. There's pre-conferences, which I think are very good. They're all-day sessions on a certain topic. They've already been chosen. You can go to sequelpass.org and click on Summit and get all of the pre-cons and so forth. If you have not registered, the discount is until September 18th. If you use this code here, VC15FPS6, you'll save $150 on registration. And so pop over to the sequelpass.org and Summit now and get additional information. Those are all kind of online, but the Summit is actually personal, is face-to-face rather, but they are local chapters. Again, if you go to sequelpass.org and click on chapters, you'll find a local chapter, hopefully very close to where you live and work. The benefits of those, I'm here in Silicon Valley, and I go to the one right at the Microsoft Center, and it's really great. You get to meet with folks and on a monthly basis and connect. I've interviewed folks for jobs from that location, so it's just a great time to meet people face to face and talk about real life SQL Server issues and or how you did it, or just commiserate. And PASS is a volunteer-run organization, and so if you have a passion for SQL Server or helping other people with SQL Server, please consider volunteering, because at this point that's how it's all run. We appreciate all the help that we get from our volunteers, and if you have a time you can do that, please go to sequelpass.org and say, I want to volunteer, and we will contact you and get you plugged in as soon as possible. And there are many ways to be involved in PASS. So there's ways to be communicated with. We have a LinkedIn page, Facebook, Twitter, as well as the pretty much mentioned sequelpass.org. That is a good launching spot for everything SQL Pass related. And with that, we want to focus our attention on today's session. Again, I mentioned Ryan Adams is today's presenter. He's going to be presenting Windows clustering for the DBA. It's a critical part of the always-on configuration, and Ryan has quite a bit of experience with that. So his primary focus has been on SQL Server, the engine, with high availability, disaster recovery. We won't hold this against him, but he was previously an Active Directory architect, and he designed his company's worldwide Active Directory infrastructure. Kudos for that, young man. He also ran the virtual chapter for, I think it was Performance, the Performance virtual chapter. So he's been involved in SQL Pass quite a bit. He's currently on the board of directors of Pass itself, as well as his local user group in Texas. And he holds the alphabet soup of certifications here. I'm not even going to try to attempt to say all those. I have not had enough coffee yet. And with that, I would like to turn the session over to you, Ryan, and you can fill our brains with good stuff about Windows clustering.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate everybody having me today. If you can make me the presenter, then we'll go ahead and get started.
You should have the ball now, sir.
All right. Let me know when you can see my screen and we'll get rolling.
I can see you.
All right, great. All right, so I'm hoping this is going to be really cool for everybody because this is a two-part series, right? So make sure you get signed up for next month. It's just too much to fit into the amount of time to fit into these hour slots. So what we're going to talk about is we're going to split this into two different pieces. So today we're going to talk about Windows clustering, just an overview. What is it? How can I use it? What are the different pieces involved? And we'll actually walk through setting one up and configuring the Windows piece. This is focused on the actual Windows piece, not so much the SQL Server piece, but we're going to keep an eye towards SQL Server because the idea is that we're setting this cluster up to support availability groups or failover cluster instances in SQL Server. And those of us that are DBAs, a lot of times we don't have a lot of exposure to those types of things on the Windows side, and it's one of those challenges that we face. And I'm always a big proponent of telling people that it doesn't matter what you're on, what platform you're on top of. You don't necessarily need to be an expert in it, but you need to know something about it. If you're on a SAN, know something about it. If you're on a cluster, know something about clustering. So get to know those underside pieces. Don't need to be an expert in it about it because all these things play together to create an environment that's going to support your production applications. So already had a pretty good intro, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I am going to be speaking at the PASS Summit, so again, use that discount code that we had earlier for the chapter. Make sure you take advantage of that. I will be speaking on managing MSDB at the PASS Summit. I haven't updated, I saw the 2015 there, but I will be speaking this year and on how to manage MSDB. I've also got a few sessions I'll be doing at IT Dev Connections for those of you looking to go to Dev Connections this year as well. I am a data platform MVP, and I do some consulting on the side in my other hours through Linchpin people, so if you're looking for some experts, no matter what it may be, DBA, BI stuff, drop me a line. We can get you hooked up there. So the things that we want to talk about overall today. The first one is going to be hardware. What type of hardware do we need? If I'm looking to set up a cluster, is there requirements that I need? Are there particular vendors that I need? What's required there? So we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about the software. We'll talk about both the Windows side of things and what I need to, pick as far as Windows goes. Do I need to go with Windows 2012, 2012 R2, is 2008 R2 okay? What are the differences between those? And we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about the SQL Server world, right? So what are the different versions? Am I okay with Standard Edition? Or do I have to have Enterprise Edition? Does it matter whether I'm running 2012, 2014, or 2016? Is there any big difference when it comes to availability groups and FCIs there? And then we'll talk a bit about networking. Networking is a really big deal when you look at clusters and how you design things. If you really want to have an efficiently built cluster, you really need to think about your network design and where things are going from point A to point B. So we'll kind of talk about the different types of networks that are required there and how we can design those. So we'll just start off with a brief introduction here of what clustering is for those that aren't familiar. Clustering in and of itself on the Windows side is actually really simple. All it means is that we have multiple servers like we see here. They're all connected together, but the idea is that if I lose any one of them, and my example here is the first one, but it doesn't really matter which one it is, then I have other servers sitting in wait, ready to take over and perform those functions for me. It's really as simple as that. Now, if we're designing a cluster, we tend to throw around words like, what is high availability? What is disaster recovery? How do I decide which one I need? And that really depends on what your business needs, right? We talk about high availability, we think about things like 5 nines and uptime, and if something were to fail over, it needs to take over very, very quickly to be up and running on the other box. Disaster recovery, on the other hand, usually that flip over is not that fast. We have a little bit more tolerance because usually it's something that's really bad has happened. We also start to think about things like, it's not a disaster recovery scenario if you have one server that can take over for, the server 2 is sitting there ready to take over server 1 and they're sitting in the same rack in the same data center. That's not really a disaster recovery solution, because if you lose the data center, you still have a serious problem going on. So we tend to think about things about different physical locations and what the ramifications are of that as far as networking and failover time and what I can stand to lose as far as data loss. So which one do you need? That all depends on the business requirements. If this is development as opposed to production, that makes a difference. If this is an internal HR database compared to your front-end website OLTP, that's going to make a difference. So just think about that, of course. Availability groups, we'll talk a little bit about that. Mirroring. It's still out there, it's still an option. It may have been marked deprecated, but it's still technically supported for almost another decade. Again, log shipping, tried and true, been around forever. Replication's still out there, it's still been around forever. So think about those other options and make the right choice. Try and know a little bit and learn a little bit about each of those if you're not familiar with them so that you can make the right choice. So let's say that we've decided that for our business, we need to have a cluster. And we need to know what can and can't be clustered. Now, there's two things that can be clustered, and that's the database engine and analysis services. The things that can't be clustered, however, are reporting services, SSIS, and the SQL browser. Now, I'm going to qualify those last three there. I'm going to qualify SSRS because with reporting services and integration services the exact same way, the actual service itself cannot be put in a cluster. Okay. But the databases, right? So think about reporting services. It has two databases. It has reporting services database and reporting services tempdb. Those databases, you can put those in the cluster because they're hosted by the database engine, which is a clustered service. It's just the reporting services service itself that hosts the front end, the web front end of everything. That, and same for integration services as well, that, as of today, you cannot put those in a cluster. So you need to find, if those need to be highly available, you need to find another method, like for reporting services, a scale-out deployment, to make those highly available. The browser, if you understand how the browser works, it doesn't actually need to be clustered. If you look in a cluster, the SQL browser service will be running on every single node in the cluster. The only difference is that because when you address a cluster, you're only talking to the active node, the browser service is running on the other nodes. Well, no traffic's going to him, so he's just kind of there sitting listening to dead air. So no harm, no foul. If he becomes running at that particular point in time, then we get pointed that direction. So although it can't be clustered, it doesn't need to be. It's running it as an individual service on every single node. Now here's some of the terminology. What I will tell you is this is a very busy slide. I know there's a lot going on here. There are two acronyms that you'll probably hear me use is AG for availability group, FCI for failover cluster instance. The rest of these, I'm going to do my best to not use the acronym, but to actually say exactly what it is. So I will say cluster name object as opposed to CNO. I'll point that out. But these are just here, so I'll provide the deck. That way you guys have this, so you can have this as a reference point in the future. And then we'll talk about all of these things as we go through here, not so much talking about them now, but we'll talk about quorum and disk witnesses and what the heartbeat is and all that kind of good stuff. So the first thing we need to do when we're designing a cluster is start getting prepared for it. So as we start preparing for this, the first thing we think about is hardware. Now, it used to be years ago that we had something called, Microsoft had what they call the hardware compatibility list, or the HCL. Now, the HCL doesn't apply anymore, thank goodness. What they did is they used to go out and they said, we're going to go to each vendor, Dell, HP, those guys, and we're going to certify certain server lines and particular server models that are going to be compliant with a cluster. So, and I'm just using this as an example, right? So our sponsor today is HP. So let's say we go out there and say, you know what, I really want to use an HP DL380. And you go out there and you look on the HCL list and a 380 might not be out there, but maybe the 580 is. So you go, okay, well, if I want to build this cluster, then 380 is not a choice for me. I need to use the 580. We don't have to do that anymore. Microsoft's gotten rid of all that. There is no more hardware compatibility list. You can use whatever hardware you want. In fact, different nodes in your cluster can actually be different models. You could have a 380 and a 580 in your cluster. You can actually do that now. That's not necessarily suggested. In fact, I suggest that you keep identical hardware across the board. It's a lot easier to manage when you start looking at software updates and driver updates and those things, that if you're consistent across the board, it's a lot easier to manage and handle that way. So although it is not required, I always highly suggest that you do it that way. And the reason that none of this stuff is required anymore is because of something called cluster validation. Cluster validation is something Microsoft's created that is absolutely required to create a cluster. It's the absolute first thing you do. If you go in and you try and create a cluster without running validation, it'll pop right up and tell you, hey, not a good idea. We're going to have to run validation first before I let you continue any further. Click next, and that's what we're going to do. Is we're going to go run validation. But what validation does is you put in all the servers that you want to be part of this cluster, however many that may be, and it looks at all of them. It looks at what software patches they have. It looks at how's the network configured. Can they all talk to each other properly? A whole host of things. What does the storage side of things look like? Is there shared storage that's presented, and can all the clusters see that? All the different nodes see that? And that's what validation does. And at the end of the wizard, it'll tell you, hey, look, either you're good, you can go ahead and create this, or no, we found some issues. Here's exactly what the issues are. You need to go resolve those first before we can validate this cluster. And what this determines is whether Microsoft is going to support the configuration that you have designed. And we'll walk through that and we'll see that a little bit later. Now on the software side of things, the first thing we have to look at is what operating system. So the real major differentiator here when you're looking at the OS is how many nodes are supported. So if you're running Server 2008 or R2, if you're in Standard Edition, you're not going to have any luck. You can't use Standard. You've got to at least have Enterprise here on the operating system side of things. If you're running Enterprise Edition, you can have up to 16 nodes in your cluster. If you're running Data Center, you can also have 16 nodes. Right? So why would you want Data Center over Enterprise if they both run 16? The answer to that is the major difference with Data Center is how many virtual machines you can have. If you're going to license it that way, it's really just a licensing thing. If memory serves correctly, I believe the difference is between 08 and 2012 you can have 1,000 virtual machines in 08, and they went up to 5,000, maybe 8,000 in 2012. But that's the only difference. Now on the 2012 and 2012 R2 side, things changed a little bit. You'll notice there's an NA in the Enterprise field there. And that's because they got rid of Enterprise Edition in the operating system. It doesn't exist anymore. What they've done is they've taken all the features from Enterprise and they've actually brought it down to Standard Edition. And again, the reason for that, it came down to virtual machine licensing. As more and more organizations start moving to virtualizing their environments, Microsoft has realized that that's where they are going to kind of reposition their licensing on that. So all of those things you will get in Standard Edition from Enterprise. They brought those down in 2012. You also get up to 64 nodes. So you can actually have a 64 node cluster running Windows Server Standard Edition. So what was new in 2012? Why would I want to pick Server 2012 or in the 2012 R2 over Windows Server 2008? And this is really a value proposition. And a lot of times we look at this stuff and we go, is it really worth the money for me to upgrade? Sometimes the features might not necessarily be worth the upgrade. This is going to be one of those cases that after I go through these slides, you can look at it and go, yeah, totally worth the money to go to 2012. When you look at some of these new features and things, and you look at the return on your investment for what you're getting out of this, there's no reason for you to be deploying Server 2008 anymore. You should definitely be on 2012. You should be looking to upgrade your clusters to 2012, and I think that'll become fairly evident. And you'll notice that this has a part 1 at the title of the slide here, and that's because for Windows Server 2012 there was so much new stuff I couldn't jam it all on one slide. We split it between 2 different slides. So looking at our top section here, the management of cluster nodes is a lot easier now in 2 different ways. One is with Server Manager. Server Manager is one of those things that back in Server 2008, and I don't know if you guys are like me, but as soon as you logged into a server, it popped right up. And it said, this is Server Manager, here's all the things that you could do on your server. And there was this tiny little checkbox right smack in the middle that said, go away, don't show up anymore. And I would always check that box. And the reason I would check that box is because it really wasn't useful for me. I never used it, I never needed it, it just didn't do me any good. Well, they've redesigned that in Server 2012, and it is extremely useful. They've done a really good job of making that useful. I can access all of my management tools and everything right out of Server Manager. You can add and remove roles right from there. Not only can you add and remove roles on that node, you can add and remove roles on other servers as well. So it's a lot more extensible than what we used to have in the past. They also made some really cool things with Cluster Manager. So after we've created the cluster and we look in Cluster Manager, we are allowed to do some more searching that we couldn't do before. It's a little bit more robust there, and we can actually do some custom views. So, and we'll talk about that next month, or actually not next month, in a couple of weeks here. In part 2, we'll talk about, and I'll show you exactly how you can do some of those custom views. The management of our clustered roles. We have priority startup and node draining. Priority startup says if I have 5 instances of SQL Server running in this cluster, and 2 of them are really more for like development and testing, and 1 of them is like production, well, if I have a failover, I want to make sure that that production guy, he needs to start first. So I can go in and I can kind of prioritize them and say, this is the order in which I want to start them in. And we'll take a look at that. I believe we'll also talk about that in a couple of weeks in part 2 as well. The same with node draining. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks as well. Node draining is super cool. It used to be that if I went in and I looked at a failover cluster instance and I looked at my role, I had a bunch of different things in there. And if I had maybe 4 or 5 different roles, because I had multiple instances on there, if patching came around and second Black Tuesday of the month comes around, it's time for me to do some patching. How do I handle patching of my cluster? Well, what I'd have to do is I have to go and say, look, I want to go ahead and patch node 1. So I need to take everything that's on node 1, move it over to node 2, patch it, reboot it, and then move everything all back over again. And if I had a node that had 5, 6, 10, 15 nodes in my cluster, that became very difficult to manage, to have to go in and move every single role that was currently running on that particular node and do that process. Node draining allows me to go in and within 2 clicks say, drain this node. It'll automatically take all 5, 6, however many roles you have, and it will spread them out among the other nodes in your cluster, and it will attempt to do it evenly as to distribute the load. And it will remember where it put them. It might take instance 2 and 3 and put it on node 6 and 4 and 5 and put it on node 12. It remembers where it put it. So when you're done, you've patched that node, you've rebooted it, and you say, I'm done now, it will automatically bring all of those services right back on that node where they came from. Very, very handy. Clustered shared volumes was something that was supported before, but they added BitLocker, so you can use full drive encryption on that now. They're available to only some nodes instead of all of them, and you can actually do a repair on them like a check disk on a cluster share volume without taking it offline. Cluster aware updating. This was, like we just talked about with patching, what this allows me to do is automate. It was really hard to automate clusters and patching before, because what I didn't want to do is have all of my nodes go down at the same time. If I've got 4 nodes in my cluster, I don't want to update all 4 nodes at the same time. If they all go down at the same time, then I'm done. All my services are down. So I didn't want that to happen. So I had to be very careful about how I arranged that. So if I was using WSUS or just using Windows Update or whatever, and maybe I was using a group policy object to say that I wanted to patch all of these servers on a particular day, I had to make sure that maybe only 2 of them went on Monday and the other 2 went on Wednesday. That way they weren't rebooting at the same time. If I didn't realize they were in a cluster or it was another group that was handling that, then things could get bad. But what clusterware updating does is it creates an actual object in Active Directory and tracks all of that. So it knows that these are nodes in a cluster. And it knows not to reboot them all at the same time. And it actually works in conjunction with node draining, where you say, go patch this cluster, throw these 5 patches on there. You don't have to tell it what nodes. You don't have to get that specific. It knows what nodes are in the cluster, and it knows what roles are running on what nodes, and it'll look at it and go, you know what, node 1, I'm going to move everything off of it, I'm going to node drain it, I'm going to patch it, I'm going to reboot it, and I'm going to move everything right back. And then I'm going to move on to node 2, and I'm going to do the same thing to that, and so on and so forth. And so it allows you to automate your patching in a much more efficient manner than what we could ever do before. We had some AD enhancements. We were able to specify the OU when we were creating virtual objects. So when you create SQL Server, it puts what we call a VCO, or a computer object, out there. Group managed service accounts, unfortunately, still weren't supported here in 2012, but that changes a little bit further down the road. The task scheduler. I know there's a lot of us out there, myself included, where there are certain things that I need to run, whether I'm running PowerShell scripts or whatever, that I need to schedule using the Windows Task Manager. The problem is if I schedule them on node 1, then I have to go recreate them and schedule them on node 2. But I don't want them to run on node 2 because he might not be active. So I only want them to be running when he's active. And that was something I had to manually script to turn on and turn off depending upon what was node. It was very difficult to manage something like that. Well, now they've clustered it. So now I only have to go in one place, create all of my jobs at one time, and he will stay active on the active node. Super cool. Dynamic quorum, not going to get into that here because we're going to talk about that a whole lot more a little bit later on.
Hey, Ryan, I have a quick question.
Yes.
You mentioned about automating this, but we have some questions about how people can get notification when a group does the patching, and you might have this failover. Some people might want to notice that. How would you accomplish that?
So there's not a built-in automated way to actually get notified of that. That is something that you would have to code and script yourself, whether that was a PowerShell script or a VB script. That's something that you would actually have to do yourself. But unfortunately, there's not really a way to do that. Obviously, everything gets logged. Everything we get logged, so whether you're looking in the log, you've got a VB script that might be looking in the log for something like that. Anytime you do get a failover or reboot on a node, you will definitely be notified of that. And same with updates. The updates will actually, if you look at it, whether it's Windows updates or WSUS or whatever, you can go into your log in the server side and you can see every single patch that got installed, what time it was installed, and whether it got rebooted or not. And it'll show the reboot reason was because of the updates. But that's something you'd actually have to script. There's nothing actually built in to alert you to that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So what was new with 2012 R2 was an Active Directory detached cluster. This sounds much cooler than it is. It sounds like I can have nodes in a cluster that aren't part of an Active Directory, which would be really cool if I had a firewall situation, maybe I had a DMZ situation where I wanted some nodes and I didn't want to have them part of an Active Directory, or maybe it's just a situation where I have an environment that I need to cluster in that I don't have Active Directory in. And it sounds like Active Directory detached cluster sounds like I don't have to be part of Active Directory, and that's actually not the case here. The nodes are still required to be joined to Active Directory. Active Directory does still have to exist here. The only difference is the CNO, which is the computer name object. So when I create a cluster, it will actually create a computer object in Active Directory. That is no longer required. The advantage to that is a DBA. A lot of times I don't have access to Active Directory to create that computer object, particularly in the default computers OU where it would normally go. we would either have to go get that pre-staged, or we would have to have access to a particular OU somewhere or an area in Active Directory to be able to do that. With the detached cluster option, it doesn't create a CNO at all. The drawback is you lose Kerberos, you have to use NTLM at that point. Not necessarily inside SQL Server, but with the Windows side. Here was the big one, the dynamic witness disk. I talked about dynamic quorum earlier in 2012, which meant that the nodes, every node, when we talk about quorum, gets a vote. And we have to have the majority of votes available for our cluster to be up and running. The dynamic witness disk, so in 2012, those nodes were dynamic, which basically means that it removes the vote. If a node goes down, it removes its node from the pool of available, which means that I can actually get all the way down to one node running and still have my cluster up. That's not something we were able to do in Server 2008. We have a dynamic witness disk, and we're going to talk a little bit more about quorum, and that'll become a little bit clearer later on. But we have a dynamic witness disk, and that is your quorum. Normally people use the W drive for witness disk or Q for the quorum drive. What this witness disk does is it also gets a vote. It was not dynamic in 2012. In 2012 R2, they made it so that its vote was also dynamic. And it'll make a lot more sense when we talk about quorum a little bit later. They also added forced quorum and the 50% node split option. So let's talk about SQL Server a little bit and what our choices are with SQL Server. In 2008, well, as you can see, if you're running Standard Edition, you're just going to get 2 nodes. If you're running Enterprise Edition in SQL Server, it's whatever the operating system was. So if you remember 08 and 08 R2 said I could have 16. If you were in Windows Server 2012, then you could have up to 64. So if you're running Enterprise Edition, it will match that. Same with the Data Center Edition in 2008 R2. Now, with SQL Server 2012, some of the new features that we got available with clustering was multi-site clustering, which meant that I could now have a cluster that's in 2 different geographic spaces that are, and to be more specific and technical about it, it's actually in different subnets, and I could have nodes in different subnets, and then I could actually have a cluster across that. So even though Windows actually supported it back on Windows Server 2008, SQL Server didn't support it until 2012. We also got to put tempdb on local storage. So before, with a cluster, with a failover cluster instance, that tempdb had to sit on shared storage. And typically, your shared storage is always going to be slower than what your local storage is going to be. So if you were experiencing a lot of tempdb contention, this was one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways you could help alleviate that was by putting tempdb on local storage. We gained a flexible failover policy, and we also gained availability groups. Those were new and released in SQL Server 2012. In 2014, they had an Add Azure Replica wizard, which meant that we could actually add a replica for an availability group up into Azure. So we can now have a hybrid deployment as opposed to just having all of our nodes on-prem. We could have some nodes on-prem and we could have some up in Azure. Secondary replicas were increased from 4 to 8. So before we were allowed to have 4 secondaries. In 2014, they jumped that up to 8. You still have the primary. So you went from a total of 5 to up to a total of 9. 4 secondaries and 1 primary, or now in 2014 you had 1 primary and 8 secondaries. One problem that would happen back in the Server 2012 or SQL Server 2012 days is that if your secondary replicas, even though they were a readable replica, when the primary went down, you could no longer read from them. In 2014, they now remain readable, so if your primary goes down or they get disconnected, you can still actually have your read-only workloads pointed to those guys. Failover cluster instances can use a clustered shared volume as a clustered shared disk. SQL Server 2016, load balancing support of read intent connections. So those, if you're using read only on your secondaries and you have a read workload, maybe you've got reporting services or something pointing to it, because you've got your RS databases sitting there in the engine, you can actually load balance those. Before it was a round robin, and it would always hit whichever one was available first, and we did that through a routing list. now they've actually load balanced that. There will be DTC support. I will say that the DTC support, it's not fully supported. That's something that I'll let you guys research on your own, but there are some gotchas to the DTC support, so just know that it's not entirely fully supported in the manner in which you might think it is. Do a little research on that. Group managed service accounts were now allowed. Group managed service accounts, if you're not familiar with them, I talked about them a couple slides back as well. The really awesome thing about that is if you have a service account that's running everything, well, that service account normally would change passwords, right? Well, that's kind of not cool in a cluster. That's really hard to manage in a cluster. So what we would do is we go in and we set our passwords to never expire. Well, that's not really the best security mechanism on the face of the planet, right? To have a password that just never expires. We want to be able to rotate that. We want it to be a long, complex password. What a group managed service account does is it manages the password for you. In fact, every single computer that's part of Active Directory or gets added to Active Directory has a password to it. You might not even realize that. Your laptop that's joined to Active Directory, your desktop that's joined to AD has a computer object. That computer object has a password. It's a long, complex password. It is changed on a regular interval. You never have to see it. You never touch it. That's what a group managed service account does for us, but it allows me to do it for my Windows services. Whether we're talking about the cluster service, we're talking about the SQL Server service. Very, very cool. We never have to manage it again. Automatic failover for up to 3 replicas. In 2012 and 2014, the automatic failover was only good for 2 replicas, but now they've added a 3rd. So installation of things. There are a few prerequisites for the installation of things. The roles and features need to be added. If you're going to use the MSDTC, you do need to add the application server role if you're going to use that. If not, then just the failover clustering feature needs to be added. If you're doing a failover cluster instance as opposed to availability group, you'll want MPIO installed if you're going to use that. Every node actually has to be in the same domain. Domain account needs to be an administrator on every single one of your nodes. And the install account needs to have rights to create that CNO or that computer name object. Again, that is the computer object that represents the cluster. So as soon as you create the cluster, it's going to create that computer object in Active Directory. You need to have the rights to be able to do that. If you're pre-staging it, meaning that you are creating the computer object in Active Directory prior to creating the cluster, you need to remember to disable the computer object. Your AD guy might think that's a little weird that you're asking him to create him a computer object and then disable it. However, that is a requirement. Private network. When we go to install, best practice here is going to have a private network. You want to have dedicated NIC cards to the private network. If you're only having 2 nodes, the most common way to do that was use a crossover cable. Obviously, you can't do that if you have more than 2 nodes. It's best that each node hits a separate switch. If you run them all to the same switch and you lose the switch, then you just lost everything. You don't have a separate path to get there. You need to be on a subnet that's different from the public. So the public network is what all of your traffic comes in, that your users and your applications are coming in on. The private network is only for the cluster itself for that heartbeat traffic. They do need to be on different subnets. That is required. The good news here is I've listed the class A, B, and C private ranges, so you can use these ranges. They're non-internet routable, but you can use these ranges, and it's very common to use those for the private network since it doesn't need to be internet routable. Public network, again, use dedicated NIC cards. You're separating the traffic. If I put my public traffic and I put my cluster traffic on the same network, that's an awful lot of data I'm shoving over a single pipe. And I need to really think about how much data is going over that pipe, because what happens is if it starts getting to the point where this is a high OLTP and I've got a lot of data coming over this pipe and it starts getting too jammed up, then all of a sudden those heartbeats start missing and they get lost over the network and they never make it to the other side. And if the cluster starts missing enough of those heartbeats, then you're going to have nodes that start failing over, and we start getting what we call flapping. And this one node's going to fail over, and it's going to fail back, and it's going to fail over again. And as it turns out, there's actually nothing wrong with it. It doesn't need to be failing over. It just can't talk, and that's the reason why. So make sure you separate these public and private networks. Put them on separate NIC cards. Make sure you're hitting separate switches is just the same as the other one. If you're doing iSCSI, that's a serious amount of traffic. Again, separate your traffic as much as you can. The more you can separate your traffic, the less issues you're going to have. iSCSI is an absolutely perfect example. If you're going iSCSI and you've got a storage network, make sure that you've got that on a different NIC card. And obviously, if you're using HBAs, make sure you're prepared to know how to configure the HBAs if you're connecting over fiber. IP requirements, you're going to need a cluster network name. You're going to need an IP for every single node, times 2, right? Because you need the public side and the private side. So every node's going to need a public and a private. Every instance of SQL Server that you're installing is going to need an IP address. The MSDTC, if you're going to use an MSDTC, that is also going to be required to have an IP address. Your storage NICs will also need IPs if you're going to do dedicated NICs for your storage. DNS, the list is almost the same. You need a DNS name for almost every single IP that we just listed, so the cluster itself needs one. The node, so on the nodes, the private doesn't actually need a DNS name because that guy just talks over IP addresses and he's not really routed anywhere. However, I usually do put a DNS name to it because it's a lot easier when it comes time to troubleshooting if I have a DNS name that I can do forward and reverse lookups. So I prefer to do that, but it's not actually required. Every instance of SQL Server, of course, is going to need the DNS name and the MSDTC. So let's get into a demo here and take a look at setting up a cluster. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up my first node here. I'll log in. And I had a bad feeling this might happen to me, so I was running validation earlier on this to see if this demo was going to work. As you can see, I've actually already completed the validation wizard here, and he didn't come up looking very good. I'm going to view the report here real quick and see how bad it is. It might not actually be that bad. It is. It looks like I got some networking issues. It'll live. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and just let that finish in the background, and then we're just going to take a look at a few things that we actually need, and then we'll come back. A lot of people like to use the word geo-clustering and multi-site clustering, but that's not the differentiator. It's not necessarily the fact that it's in a different data center or a different physical location that allows this to work. It's the fact that it's in a different subnet, and that's the actual technical piece of it. So these could actually be in the same data center, but if they're in different subnets, then it's really considered a multi-subnet cluster. People like to use the word multi-site and all that kind of stuff, but multi-subnet's really the term we kind of want to use there. So they're already joined to a domain. I've kind of already done that, and I've added the first thing we have to do is we need to add the failover clustering feature. So I've already done that, but I want to at least show you where it is. So as I told you, we talked about the server manager earlier. So as soon as we log in, the server manager comes up. It's actually pretty useful now. If I go to add roles and features, we'll go to next. We're just doing a role-based here, not remote desktop. Because I'm in a cluster, it already sees them all. It says, which one do you want to look at? And remember, that was one cool thing I told you is that now we can actually go do this. I can be sitting here on node 1, and I can actually go make these changes over on node 5 if I need to. So I'll go next. It's not actually a role. So it's actually considered a feature, so I'm not going to check anything off here. And then we'll go into the features. So the feature is actually listed right here. And let me open up my zoom in here. I can kind of zoom in and we can take a look at things a little bit better. So here's my failover clustering. Now it's grayed out because I've already installed it, so we don't have to go ahead and do that. if I check this box off, it's going to pop up another window that says, hey, if you're installing this feature, there's some tools you probably ought to install with it. And the tools are actually down here, and it'll automatically do this for you. But I'll show you where it is, and I'll tell you why I want you to know where it's at. So it's under Remote Server Administration Tools, under Feature Administration Tools, and then there's a section dedicated to failover clustering tools right here. And I'll zoom in here in just a second. Let me scroll over so at least fit all on one screen. So here's my section that I'm looking at. And I'm looking at this first guy here, which is the failover cluster management tools. And the module for PowerShell, when it pops up that window, it's going to automatically check those off. What it's not going to check off is the very last one down here. And this is the command line interface. So this is cluster.exe. So if you're used to using cluster.exe and you're familiar with that and you want it, you need to come down here to these tools and check that off. So by default, what they're doing here is everything's going to PowerShell now, and they want you to manage everything, including your cluster, out of PowerShell. So in this particular instance, what you'll need to do is come down here and check that off if you still want to use that. The idea is that that will eventually go away, so you're going to need to learn how to use the PowerShell commands to manage your cluster. But if you still want it, it is here. You just have to go down and check that guy off. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of here because I've already done that. But that's the first thing you'll have to do to build your cluster. The next thing you need to do is configure your network cards. So let's go take a look and see what mine look like. So I've just got these two cards here. But what you're going to notice here is that I've named them, right? Normally, the name here looks a lot more like this, Intel Pro 1000. It looks close to the device name, right? They don't have this private public name, and I've renamed them, and I did that for a reason, because once we create the cluster, you're going to look at this and go, man, I don't know what's what. Well, if you label them private and public, you'll know which one's which. So on every single node, you're going to want to do that, and I've done that on every node. And I'm using different IP ranges, so I can go in and look at my private range. If I look at my IPs here, I'm using the 192.168 range. This guy's using 192.168.5.1. Node 2 is using 5.2, .3, .4, .5, so on and so forth. And that's on the private side. On the public side, I'm using a different subnet. And remember, that is required. Those two do have to be on different subnets. And I'm using the 10 range here. Oops, sorry. 10.0.0.1 because he's node 1, 10.0.0.2 for node 2, 3 for node 4, so on and so forth. The one thing you'll notice it is a little bit different, and I forgot to show you this on the private side of my network, that if you look at a 2-node cluster, a lot of times people are not used to seeing a gateway listed here. Well, the reason the gateway is listed here is because, remember, node 5, he's not on this network. He's on a completely different network. He's in the 172 range. He's a different subnet. Well, the only way that I'm going to get to him and be able to talk to him is if I have a gateway. I have to have some type of router to tell the traffic how to get there. So normally, if you have 2 nodes and you have a cable running directly between the two, which is the more traditional way to set that up, you wouldn't have a gateway here. So it looks a little odd why you would have a gateway here, but that's the reason why I have a gateway on the private side. The public side's obvious. That's what all my users are coming in, so obviously I need to be able to get out to my network. So that's what my network looks like. The other thing, oops, let me go back. One other thing you do need to be aware of, if I could click on the right thing, is the order in which they are bound. In 2012, you'll notice right here where it says organize, that's all that's up here. If I hit the Alt key, there's some more options that were completely hidden from me. If I go under Advanced and I look at Advanced Settings here, this will bring up the binding order, and this is the order in which they're bound. The requirement for a cluster is that it wants the public to be on the top. Mine's actually not on the top. I actually need to move that. So we need the public to be bound first. If they are not bound first, the validation wizard will come back and throw an error at you, and it will tell you, hey, by the way, this isn't bound first. You should probably go fix it. All right, so that's it for the networking side of things. Configuring storage would be the next piece of things that we need to take a look at. So for me in this instance, I'm actually using iSCSI. So if I go under Tools, I've installed my iSCSI initiator, and I've actually already mounted my drives. And you'll notice that I've got 3 of them here. And let me zoom in so you can see that a little bit better. What you'll notice is at the very end of the name here, I've got 3 drives. The idea is that my data drive holds all my MDFs and my data files. My log drive will hold all my LDFs and my log files. And then my quorum drive will be dedicated to the witness disk that I want to have for quorum on this particular cluster. So we've got those 3 drives. If I were to go in and look in computer management, I can actually see that I've already mounted these drives. They should be here and available. Looking in disk management, sure enough, they are here. I can see that, and this is just from running the validation wizard. They're currently offline. I've got 3 drives here. They're all 1 gig apiece. And when you go in and you do this, on the very first node, you're going to need to bring it online. Now, typically, when this is the very first time that you do this, you won't see this. Like mine says quorum drive. If I bring these others online, they've automatically got drive letters and they've got labels and they're formatted already. And that's only because I've done this demo more than once. These drives already exist. They've already been formatted and labeled, and it remembers that. It won't be like that for you. What you'll have to do is bring it online. Then you'll right-click here and you'll have to initialize it. You'll see an option for initialize. Obviously, that's already been done, so we can't do that. And then you'll have to format it. Now, that I can show you if I go to format here. I won't actually do it. This is where I can give it a label, formatted in TFS. And what the interesting part is this allocation unit size. So SQL Server likes to write things in 8K data pages in extents of 8, which comes out to 64K. So it's more efficient if I format my drive here at 64K. So we want to remember to make sure that we format all of our drives that are going to host SQL Server data or backups at 64K. And then you would format it, everything would show up on here, and life would be all good. So then what we'd want to do is we'd want to run cluster validation. So I already, because it takes a while to run cluster validation, I actually already ran, and you kind of saw that earlier, right? Not here, where'd it go? I already ran cluster validation. It didn't come back very nice, unfortunately. It looks like I had some networking issues here. And that's just a remnant of my virtual, or my cluster here. However, it's allowing me to go ahead and create it. So I'm going to go ahead and create it. And it says, what do you want your cluster name to be? And I'm just going to be real simple. We're just going to call it cluster 1. And this is what that CNO, that cluster name object is. So it's actually going to create a computer object in Active Directory called cluster 1 or whatever you type here. And then I've got to give it some IP addresses. Now remember, I've got a node, node 5, who's in a different IP range. So I have to have one IP for each subnet. So I'm going to have to go in and do that. So I'm going to use the 10 range here first. IP I'm going to give him is 10. And I am not going to use this one. My other range is the 172.16 range. So remember, the 10 range we looked at earlier, he was valid here on this node. He's actually valid on nodes 1, 2, 3, and 4. But the ranges that I'm using over here, this is going to be the 172.16 range. That is actually what I am using for on node 5. So we'll use that. So we'll go ahead and click next on this guy. He'll take a second to go out here and kind of do his thing. He's got to validate that those IPs are valid. There is this add all eligible storage to the cluster. I'll go ahead and leave that checked. And then it's going to go through and create the cluster based on my validation. Now, taking a look at the validation, let me go back here and look at the report while that thing's running. And I'll show you what the validation wizard itself looks like because we can run that again. But I didn't want us to have to sit here and twiddle our thumbs forever. So here's the validation report, and it's actually a really nice report and very handy. So I can see that I've had some failures here on the network, and I had some system configuration issues. And if I click on system configuration, it'll automatically take me down to the section for system config. Everything actually in this area for the system config came back good except for the software update levels. So that means I've probably got some KBs and stuff that are installed on some nodes but not on the others. So if I click that, it's actually really specific. It tells me exactly what's going on. I have 5 nodes here, so it says, hey, right here on node 1, you're missing this patch. But it also tells me that, hey, I'm good on node 2. All software updates are present. All software updates are present on node 3, node 4, and node 5. So in order to resolve this, all I need to do is go in, find this patch, whatever KB 301.3410 is, go install that patch, and then this problem will go away. Let's see if the cluster finished here. So it did. It looks like it finished. I'll go ahead and click Finish. And then we'll kind of inspect it to see what things look like. So I can see, sure enough, cluster1stars.com is the domain name that I'm joined to. So I get cluster1stars.com. Clicking here on the cluster at the very top, this is all of my cluster resources. So I can see that cluster1stars.com is the name. It's currently on node 2 is where it's running. It looks like I do have a couple of errors going on that I should probably look into. It did find a disk witness. So that's there for my quorum drive. Let's see what that is. It says that it's a cluster disk 2. Now, we were in computer management earlier, and I'm not going to be able to see it here because it's not running. It's running on node 2. But if I were to go look at node 2, I'd want to know what disk that is. So let me expand that down here. And so this tells me here's what your cluster core resources were. I decided that cluster disk 2 is where we're going to put it. And cluster disk 2 is my J drive. Well, that's not the drive it was supposed to be on. Q drive, my quorum drive, is where it was supposed to be. So you'll notice that when I went through, nowhere during the wizard, it never asked me when I created the cluster, it didn't ask me where I wanted my quorum drive to be at. In fact, it didn't even ask me anything about quorum. It didn't ask me what kind of model I wanted. It didn't ask me what drive I wanted my witness disk to be on. So what they've done now is the wizard looks at everything that's available and all the resources that you've provided inside this cluster, and it decides what it thinks is best. Well, that's not what I wanted. I'm going to have to go change that, and I can. We won't do that today, but we can actually go through and change that to another drive. But that's one of the heads up I want to give you, is to make sure you validate and look at everything in your cluster when you're done completing it to make sure that it actually did what you wanted it to do. This is not what I wanted. That's not at all what I wanted to do. That's something I'm going to have to go back and fix. Hey, check this out. This is interesting, and this looks a little bit different than normal. This is the IP address, my cluster, for my cluster right here. That doesn't look good. Why do I have this IP address? It says it's offline. That doesn't seem real cool. But think about it. It's currently running on node 2, which has the IP in the 10 range, and it shows to be online. But that 172 address down there, it's only valid on node 5 because node 5 is sitting in that different subnet in that 172 network. He's not in the 10 network. So since he's running on node 2 right now, that actually can't be valid. If I were to fail this over to node 5, those would flip. Your 172 would come online, your 10.0 address would go offline. It knows that whatever node it's on, whichever IP is valid for that node is the one that is going to bring online. That's the magic between having a multi-subnet cluster and not having one that they added in Server 2012. In fact, the real magic behind it is very simple. It's right here in this OR clause. If you look at a cluster prior to 2012, the only thing you will have here is an AND. This OR will not be available. And what this is saying is I can use this IP or I can use this IP, whichever one is valid for the current network that I happen to be on. If I come down and look at my nodes, I can see, sure enough, hey, look, there's all 5 of my nodes. We talked about dynamic quorum. We won't get into the specifics of that this week. We will in part 2 in a couple of weeks. We'll talk about what this assigned vote and this current vote means and how we can view that. If I look at my networks here, this is interesting. Here's all my networks. I have 4 of them. That's quite a few networks. Here's why I tell you to label them. And we're going to inspect these a lot more in the next couple of weeks. But look, this must be my private network because it says node 1234 private. Why does it say private? Because I labeled my NIC cards before I created my cluster. You can still label them after the fact, but the point I'm trying to drive home here is when you look at all these networks and the cards that are in them, the IPs, if you label them properly, it will make your life so much easier when something breaks and you're in panic mode and you're trying to figure out what is what. This makes things very, very clear, so take advantage of that. We'll talk more about the network stuff next time. And how we can label these in here and how they work and how they're supposed to talk and how we configure those. We'll talk more about storage next time as well. We talked about it a little bit here and the fact that we've got 3 disks here, the fact that it picked the wrong disk witness quorum drive. Next time we'll go through and we'll fix that and we'll show you how to change that over to the drive that it's supposed to be on and some of the caveats with that. So that's all I've got for today. We've walked through quite a bit of different stuff, a lot of information we shared today. We talked about the hardware requirements, the software requirements, the networking. It's pretty in-depth on the networking side of things. We've kind of discussed all of that. And then we walked through actually creating and validating a cluster, a 5-node multi-subnet cluster here today. And so that was pretty simple, pretty easy, right? If you plan when you're creating your cluster, your deployment will go 10,000 times smoother. I have run across so many different folks and clients and things that I work with that say, look, I really hate clustering. It is so complicated and hard. Every time I do it, there's issues. But if you get all of the things you need up front, the IPs you need, the DNS names that you need, the storage up front, everything is provisioned, created, and available but prior to creating the cluster, and you get it all validated and everything comes across clean, I promise it will go so much smoother and so much easier. You'll look at yourself and go, wow, I wonder why I feared this to begin with. Hopefully this will alleviate that fears. Hopefully you can take this slide deck back and it'll give you a checklist of things that you need so when you go to deploy and create your own. So I know we're kind of up against time. We're actually a little bit over time. I'm willing to hang out and answer some questions if we have time to do that. If we need to wrap it up, that's fine. Any questions that you put into the chat window, if we can't verbally answer those today, I'll be able to get a list of those, and what I'll do is I'll actually go through all of those questions and I'll blog answers to all of them, and I'll get all of that put on my blog, which you can see here on the slide down at the bottom. RyanJAdams.com is my blog, and you can follow me out there on Twitter as Ryan J. Adams as well, and we'll get all that stuff out there and available for you, and we'll get all your questions answered. And of course, don't forget 2 more weeks. Go get signed up for that one. Come back. We're very heavy on the demo stuff in the next couple of weeks, but we're going to start talking about server manager and the cluster manager and the node draining and how that works and the cluster aware updating and how dynamic quorum works. And we're going to demo and walk through all of that. And a lot of that stuff will become much, much clearer.
Okay. Ryan, I want to thank you very much. A thought that comes to mind, you said the word when you went through the cluster wizard and it made some decisions for you, that this is pretty much magic these days compared to how it was in 2008 R2. So a really good starter for the series here. I appreciate that. I have a lot of notes that I want to have answered in the next few sessions, so that's great. We do have a set of nice questions here that we can go over today. We can capture those as long as you have time available. They'll be on the recording as well. And Ryan alluded to the next session where he'll go on part 2, and that will be August 10th. So if you want to put that on your calendar and come back for part 2 to get more detail on this, it'd be great. This is good stuff, folks. If you haven't done this, it's stuff you want to know. If you have done it, it's stuff you want to review. So a couple questions here. One is relating to the domains. Can you cluster in different domains even if it's trusted?
So that you cannot. typically with domains, when you have domains that are trusted, usually that stuff's allowed, right? As long as there's a full two-way transit of trust between the two, even sometimes with selective trust if you do it right. This is the one exception to that rule. Every node absolutely has to be in the same domain. It cannot be in a child domain. It can't be in a trusted domain. They have to be in the exact same domain. That is one of the requirements. That story does change with Server 2016.
Okay. For multi-subnet clusters, how many sites can be supported as part of the cluster?
There is no limit to how many sites. Now again, with a cluster, anytime you think about that, you have to think about network traffic and how far you're going, and if you're replicating traffic over those, particularly if you're using an availability group, or you have multiple clusters that you're mirroring between or something like that. You do need to think about the amount of traffic that you're pushing across if you do multiple sites, but there's not an actual technical limit to how many subnets you can have nodes in.
I found that question interesting. I had never thought about that. That's interesting. So someone wanted to know if you had a DNS naming convention that you could share. You know, as you're kind of getting on this journey here, like you use a private public kind of a thing, but do you take that further?
So the DNS naming convention is great. I'm a huge proponent of naming conventions and enforcing those types of things, especially in a large enterprise. And I work in a very large enterprise myself every day. So sometimes the naming conventions aren't necessarily what you get to choose. They're what the enterprise chooses or the server guys choose. The only thing I can tell you on naming convention with a cluster is if you can make it clear somehow that they are connected or related to each other, that will be handy. The one thing you do need to make sure of is that every single node in Active Directory needs to be in the same OU, and that'll help make it clear. Put a description field on the object in Active Directory. Most people don't take advantage of that or think of that. Even if you have to ask the AD guy to do it, to put one in there because you might want to know what they are, right? So, like we had 5 nodes today, but we called it cluster 1. So I might want to go into the description field of all 5 nodes and say, this is a node in cluster 1. That way, if I'm looking at an Active Directory, I know. But as far as a specific name, I mean, that's going to vary depending upon your organization. But if you can have some type of consistency or relation between them and show that, that would be the best idea.
Okay. So all these instructions and demos that you did today on the cluster, do they apply to when you create a cluster on a VM as well, or is it different?
Yes. No, actually, they're exactly the same. In fact, what I did today, those were all VMs, right? So I'm actually running, I use VirtualBox. Every single one of these, domain controller and all 5 nodes are actually VMs. So the story doesn't change when you're on a VM. The one difference to that is if you're running an availability group and you want to separate your traffic and you want to put availability group traffic on a separate NIC card, the one thing you need to think about with that is it really going through a separate physical NIC on the back end because it's a VM. So if you're not going into VMware or whatever you're using and dedicating a physical NIC to it, are you really gaining anything out of it? So you might not necessarily need to separate that because you might not be able to, and it also might actually be handled on the back end the way they separate the traffic coming out of the actual host itself.
Okay. And yes, Virginia, that is an Oracle application there. So during the demo,
Yeah,
yeah, I know when you were
I feel dirty every time I install it.
I know it's like you got to take a shower afterwards. During the demo itself, when you were attaching drives, can you use mount points anymore, or does it just have to be attached the old-fashioned way?
That's a good question. I actually don't know about that for mount points, if you can use a mount point for that.
Okay.
You can use mount points. Let's see. No, I take that back. You can use mount points for that because you're going to run out of drive letters if you don't. So you can actually use mount points for that.
Yeah.
I've done that before with a cluster that was a file share that had hosted a ton of file shares on it where there just weren't drives for all of that. That would be one common place to use a mount point, yeah.
And here's a question for you. When you were doing the formatting the drives in the demo again, where you chose 64K for the size, is this good for backups only, or is it also good for data and log as well?
No, it's good for all of the above. So data, log, and backups, all of them.
Okay, cool. Here's one. I'm not sure I understand it but I'm going to read it how it was submitted. Is how is the OR option for the online, offline, and the different IPs there different from an active passive cluster configuration?
So that's not different. That didn't really have anything to do with whether you're being active passive or not. Active passive is some old terminology that we don't really use anymore. We just call everything a failover cluster node, depending upon what whether it's an active node or not. But that OR clause on the IP address is what enables you to have a node in a different subnet. Before you couldn't do that, because if you think about it, if I fail a node over to another subnet, that's a different IP address on a different range. How do I give a single network name multiple IP addresses? And although you can do that in DNS and you can do that there, you couldn't do that inside the cluster. And so that's all that does is allow you to do that. So like if I were to fail this guy over to node 5, those IPs would actually switch and the other ones would become green. Hopefully I answered that question the way that they were.
Yeah, I think so. One last question here, and then we'll kind of wrap this up. Is are SPNs still supported, and what's their role in clustering?
Yeah, so SPNs still are supported. For those who don't know, SPNs are called service principal names, and it's not really a support issue so much as it's whether you want to use them or not. So a service principal name allows you to enable Kerberos to your SQL Server instance. So they're not a requirement. I highly suggest that you do. If you haven't looked into the difference between NTLM and Kerberos, being a former Active Directory guy, you should, and you will be convinced of why you want to use Kerberos over NTLM. But service principal names are absolutely required. They're a little trickier in a cluster, depending upon how you install SQL Server, on where they're supposed to go.
Okay, and with that, I'd like to thank Ryan for his time and everyone else for hanging out here for the whole session and the question and answer time. We're looking forward to Ryan's part 2 on August 10th. So with that, folks, wrapping up today, and we'll see you on August 10th. Take care and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.